Bourgonef, Part 2 of the Lock and Key Library. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Margaret S. Bayat. The Lock and Key Library, edited by Julian Hawthorne. Bourgonef, by Anonymous, Part 2. Chapter 4. A Discovery. Bourgonef's remark had been but too sagacious. The police were hopelessly baffled. In all such cases possible success depends upon the initial suggestion either of a motive which leads to a suspicion of the person, or of some person which leads to a suspicion of the motive. Once set suspicion on the right track, and evidence is suddenly alight in all quarters. But unhappily, in the present case, there was no assignable motive, no shadow darkening any person. An episode now came to our knowledge in which Bourgonef manifested an unusual depth of interest. I was led to notice this interest because it had seemed to me that in the crime itself, and the discussions which arose out of it, he shared but little of the universal excitement. I do not mean that he was indifferent, by no means. But the horror of the crime did not seem to fascinate his imagination as it fascinated ours. He could talk quite as readily of other things, and far more readily of the French affairs. But on the contrary, in this new episode he showed peculiar interest. It appeared that Lehfeldt, moved, perhaps, partly by a sense of the injustice which had been done to Kerkel in even suspecting him of the crime, and in submitting him to an examination more poignantly affecting to him under such circumstances than a public trial would have been under others, and moved partly by the sense that Lieschen's love had practically drawn Kerkel within the family, for her choice of him as a husband had made him morally, if not legally, a son-in-law, and moved partly by the sense of loneliness which had now settled on their childless home. Lehfeldt had in the most pathetic and considerate terms begged Kerkel to take the place of his adopted son, and become joint partner with him in the business. This, however, Kerkel had gently yet firmly declined. He averred that he felt no injury, though great pain had been inflicted on him by the examination. He himself, in such a case, would not have shrunk from demanding that his own brother should be tried under suspicions of similar urgency. It was simple justice that all who were suspected should be examined, justice also to them that they might forever clear themselves of doubtful appearances. But for the rest, while he felt his old affectionate respect for his master, he could recognize no claim to be removed from his present position. Had she lived, said the heartbroken youth, he would gladly have consented to accept any fortune which her love might bestow, because he felt that his own love and the devotion of a life might repay it. But there was nothing now that he could give in exchange. For his services he was amply paid. His feelings towards Lieschen's parents must continue what they had ever been. In vain Lehfeldt pleaded. In vain many friends argued. Franz remained respectfully firm in his refusal. This, as I said, interested Bourgonef immensely. He seemed to enter completely into the minds of the sorrowing, pleading parents and the sorrowing, denying lover. He appreciated and expounded their motives with a subtlety and delicacy of perception which surprised and delighted me. It showed the refinement of his moral nature. But at the same time it rendered his minor degree of interest in the other aspects of the story, those which had a more direct and overpowering appeal to the heart, a greater paradox. Human nature is troubled in the presence of all mystery which has not by long familiarity lost its power of soliciting attention, and for my own part I have always been uneasy in the presence of moral problems. Puzzled by the contradictions which I noticed in Bourgonef, I tried to discover whether he had any general repugnance to stories of crimes, or any special repugnance to murders, or finally any strange repugnance to this particular case now everywhere discussed. And is it not a little remarkable that during 3 separate interviews, in the course of which I severally, and as I thought artfully, introduced these topics, making them seem to arise naturally out of the suggestion of our talk, I totally failed to arrive at any distinct conclusion? I was afraid to put the direct question, "Do you not share the common feeling of interest in criminal stories?" This question would doubtless have elicited a categorical reply, but somehow the consciousness of an arrière-pensée made me shrink from putting such a question. Reflecting on this indifference on a special point, and on the numerous manifestations I had noticed of his sensibility, I came at last to the conclusion that he must be a man of tender heart, whose delicate sensibilities easily shrank from the horrible under every form, and no more permitted him to dwell unnecessarily upon painful facts than they permit imaginative minds to dwell on the details of an operation. I had not long settled this in my mind before an accident suddenly threw a lurid light upon many details noticed previously, and painfully revived that inexplicable repulsion with which I had at first regarded him. A new suspicion filled my mind, or rather, let me say, a distinct shape was impressed upon many fluctuating suspicions. It scarcely admitted of argument, and at times seemed preposterous; nevertheless it persisted. The mind which in broad daylight assents to all that can be alleged against the absurdities of the belief in apparitions, will often acknowledge the dim terrors of darkness and loneliness, terrors at possibilities of supernatural visitations. In like manner, in the clear daylight of reason I could see the absurdity of my suspicion, but the vague stirrings of feeling remained unsilenced. I was haunted by the dim horrors of a possibility. Thus it arose. We were both going to Munich, and Bourgonef had shortened his contemplated stay at Nuremberg, that he might have the pleasure of accompanying me, adding also that he too should be glad to reach Munich, not only for its art, but for its greater command of papers and intelligence respecting what was then going on in France. On the night preceding the morning of our departure, I was seated in his room, smoking and discussing as usual, while Ivan, his servant, packed up his things in 2 large portmanteaus. Ivan was a serf who spoke no word of any language but his own. Although of a brutal, almost idiotic type, he was loudly eulogized by his master as the model of fidelity and usefulness. Bourgonef treated him with gentleness, though with a certain imperiousness, much as one might treat a savage mastiff which it was necessary to dominate without exasperating. He more than once spoke of Ivan as a living satire on physiognomists and phrenologists, and as I am a phrenologist, I listened with some incredulity. "Look at him," he would say. "Observe the low retreating brow, the flat face, the surly mouth, the broad base of the head, and the huge bull-like neck. Would not anyone say Ivan was as destructive as a panther, as tenacious as a bulldog, as brutal as a bull? Yet he is the gentlest of sluggish creatures, and as tender-hearted as a girl. That thick-set muscular frame shrouds a hare's heart. He is so faithful and so attached that I believe for me he would risk his life, but on no account could you get him to place himself in danger on his own account. Part of his love for me is gratitude for having rescued him from the conscription. The dangers incident to a military life had no charm for him." Now, although Bourgonef, who was not a phrenologist, might be convinced of the absence of ferocious instincts in Ivan, to me, as a phrenologist, the statement was eminently incredible. All the appearances of his manner were such as to confirm his master's opinion. He was quiet, even tender in his attentions, but the tyrannous influence of ideas and physical impressions cannot be set aside, and no evidence would permanently have kept down my distrust of this man. When women shriek at the sight of a gun, it is vain that you solemnly assure them that the gun is not loaded. "I don't know," they reply. "At any rate, I don't like it." It was much in this attitude with regard to Ivan. He might be harmless. I didn't know that. What I did know was that I didn't like his looks. On this night he was moving noiselessly about the room, employed in packing. Bourgonef's talk rambled over the old themes, and I thought I had never before met with one of my own age whose society was so perfectly delightful. He was not so conspicuously my superior on all points that I felt the restraints inevitably imposed by superiority, yet he was in many respects sufficiently above me in knowledge and power to make me eager to have his assent to my views where we differed, and to have him enlighten me where I knew myself to be weak. In the very moment of my most cordial admiration came a shock. Ivan, on passing from one part of the room to the other, caught his foot in the strap of the portmanteau and fell. The small wooden box, something of a glove box, which he held in his hand at the time, fell on the floor, and falling over, discharged its contents close to Bourgonef's feet. The objects which caught my eyes were several pairs of gloves, a rouge pot and hare's foot, and a black beard. By what caprice of imagination was it that the sight of this false beard lying at Bourgonef's feet thrilled me with horror? In one lightning flash I beheld the archway, the stranger with the startled eyes, this stranger no longer unknown to me, but too fatally recognized as Bourgonef, and at his feet the murdered girl. Moved by what subtle springs of suggestion I know not, but there before me stood that dreadful vision, seen in a lurid light, but seen as clearly as if the actual presence of the objects were obtruding itself upon my eyes. In the inexpressible horror of this vision, my heart seemed clutched with an icy hand. Fortunately, Bourgonef's attention was called away from me. He spoke angrily some short sentence, which of course was in Russian, and therefore unintelligible to me. He then stooped, and picking up the rouge pot, held it towards me with his melancholy smile. He was very red in the face, but that may be either of anger or the effect of sudden stooping. "I see you are surprised at these masquerading follies," he said, in a tone which, though low, was perfectly calm. "You must not suppose that I beautify my sallow cheeks on ordinary occasions." He then quietly handed the pot to Ivan, who replaced it with the gloves and the beard in the box, and after making an inquiry which sounded like a growl, to which Bourgonef answered negatively, he continued his packing. Bourgonef resumed his cigar and his argument as if nothing had happened. The vision had disappeared, but a confused mass of moving figures took its place. My heart throbbed so violently that it seemed to me as if its tumult must be heard by others. Yet my face must have been tolerably calm, since Bourgonef made no comment on it. I answered his remarks in vague fragments, for, in truth, my thoughts were flying from conjecture to conjecture. I remembered that the stranger had a florid complexion. Was this rouge? It is true that I fancied the stranger carried a walking stick in his right hand. If so, this was enough to crush all suspicions of his identity with Bourgonef. But then I was rather hazy on this point, and probably did not observe a walking stick. After a while my inattention struck him, and looking at me with some concern, he inquired if there was anything the matter. I pleaded a colic, which I attributed to the imprudence of having indulged in sauerkraut at dinner. He advised me to take a little brandy, but, affecting a fresh access of pain, I bade him good night. He hoped I should be all right on the morrow. If not, he added, we can postpone our journey till the day after. Once in my own room I bolted the door, and sat down on the edge of the bed in a tumult of excitement. Chapter 5. Fluctuations. Alone with my thoughts, and capable of pursuing conjectures and conclusions without external interruption, I quickly exhausted all the hypothetical possibilities of the case, and, from having started with the idea that Bourgonef was the assassin, I came at last to the more sensible conclusion that I was a constructive blockhead. My suspicions were simply outrageous in their defective evidence, and could never for one moment have seemed otherwise to any imagination less riotously active than mine. I bathed my heated head, undressed myself, and got into bed, considering what I should say to the police when I went next morning to communicate my suspicions. And it is worthy of remark, as well as somewhat ludicrously self-betraying, that no sooner did I mentally see myself in the presence of the police, and was thus forced to confront my suspicions with some appearance of evidence, than the whole fabric of my vision rattled to the ground. What had I to say to the police? Simply that, on the evening of the night when Lieschen was murdered, I had passed in a public thoroughfare a man whom I could not identify, but who, as I could not help fancying, seemed to recognize me. This man, I had persuaded myself, was the murderer, for which persuasion I was unable to adduce a tittle of evidence. It was uncolored by the remotest possibility. It was truly and simply the suggestion of my vagrant fancy, which had mysteriously settled itself into a conviction, and having thus capriciously identified the stranger with Lieschen's murderer, I now, upon evidence quite as preposterous, identified Bourgonef with the stranger. The folly became apparent even to myself. If Bourgonef had in his possession a rouge pot and false beard, I could not but acknowledge that he made no attempt to conceal them, nor had he manifested any confusion on their appearance. He had quietly characterized them as masquerading follies. Moreover, I now began to remember distinctly that the stranger did carry a walking stick in his right hand, and as Bourgonef had lost his right arm, that settled the point. Into such complications would the tricks of imagination lead me. I blushed mentally, and resolved to let it serve as a lesson in future. It is needless, however, to say that the lesson was lost, such as lessons always are lost. A strong tendency in any direction soon disregards all the teachings of experience. I am still not the less the victim of my constructive imagination because I have frequently had to be ashamed of its vagaries. The next morning I awoke with a lighter breast, rejoicing in the caution which had delayed me from any rash manifestation of suspicions now seen to be absurd. I smiled as the thought arose, what if this suspected stranger should also be pestered by an active imagination, and should entertain similar suspicions of me? He must have seen in my eyes the look of recognition which I saw in his. On hearing of the murder, our meeting may also have recurred to him, and his suspicions would have this color, wanting to mine, that I happened to inherit with my Italian blood a somewhat truculent appearance, which has gained for me among my friends the playful sobriquet of the brigand. Anxious to atone at once for my folly, and to remove from my mind any misgiving, if it existed, at my quitting him so soon after the disclosures of the masquerading details, I went to Bourgonef as soon as I was dressed, and proposed a ramble till the diligence started for Munich. He was sympathetic in his inquiries about my colic, which I assured him had quite passed away, and out we went. The sharp morning air of March made us walk briskly, and gave a pleasant animation to our thoughts. As he discussed the acts of the provisional government, so wise, temperate, and energetic, the fervor and generosity of his sentiments stood out in such striking contrast with the deed I had last night recklessly imputed to him, that I felt deeply ashamed, and was nearly carried away by mingled admiration and self-reproach to confess the absurd vagrancy of my thoughts and humbly ask his pardon. But you can understand the reluctance at a confession so insulting to him, so degrading to me. It is at all times difficult to tell a man, face to face, eye to eye, the evil you have thought of him, unless the recklessness of anger seizes on it as a weapon with which to strike, and I had now so completely unsaid to myself all that I once had thought of evil, that to put it in words seemed a gratuitous injury to me, and insult to him. A day or two after our arrival in Munich, a reaction began steadily to set in. Ashamed as I was of my suspicions, I could not altogether banish from my mind the incident which had awakened them. The image of that false beard would mingle with my thoughts. I was vaguely uncomfortable at the idea of Bourgonef's carrying about with him obvious materials of disguise. In itself, this would have had little significance, but coupled with the fact that his devoted servant was, in spite of all Bourgonef's eulogies, repulsively ferocious in aspect, capable, as I could not help believing, of any brutality, the suggestion was unpleasant. You will understand that, having emphatically acquitted Bourgonef in my mind, I did not again distinctly charge him with any complicity in the mysterious murder. On the contrary, I should indignantly have repelled such a thought, but the uneasy sense of some mystery about him, coupled with the accessories of disguise and the aspect of the servant, gave rise to dim, shadowy forebodings which ever and anon passed across my mind. Did it ever occur to you, reader, to reflect on the depths of deceit which lie still and dark even in the honestest minds? Society reposes on a thin crust of convention, underneath which lie fathomless possibilities of crime, and consequently suspicions of crime. Friendship, however close and dear, is not free from its reserves, unspoken beliefs, more or less suppressed opinions. The man whom you would indignantly defend against any accusation brought by another, so confident are you in his unshakable integrity, you may yourself momentarily suspect of crimes far exceeding those which you repudiate. Indeed, I have known sagacious men hold that perfect frankness in expressing the thoughts is a sure sign of imperfect friendship. Something is always suppressed, and it is not he who loves you that tells you candidly what he thinks of your person, your pretensions, your children, or your poems. Perfect candor is dictated by envy, or some other unfriendly feeling, making friendship a stalking horse, under cover of which it shoots the arrow which will rankle. Friendship is candid only when the candor is urgent, meant to avert impending danger, or to rectify an error. The candor which is an impertinence never springs from friendship. Love is sympathetic. I do not, of course, mean to intimate that my feeling for Bourgonef was of that deep kind which justifies the name of friendship. I only want to say that in our social relations we are constantly hiding from each other, under the smiles and courtesies of friendly interest, thoughts which, if expressed, would destroy all possible communion, and that, nevertheless, we are not insincere in our smiles and courtesies, and therefore there is nothing paradoxical in my having felt great admiration for Bourgonef, and great pleasure in his society, while all the time there was deep down in the recesses of my thoughts an uneasy sense of dark mystery which possibly connected him with a dreadful crime. This feeling was roused into greater activity by an incident which now occurred. One morning I went to Bourgonef's room, which was at some distance from mine on the same floor, intending to propose a visit to the sculpture at the Glyptothek. To my surprise I found Ivan the serf standing before the closed door. He looked at me like a mastiff about to spring, and intimated by significant gestures that I was not allowed to enter the room. Concluding that his master was occupied in some way, and desired not to be disturbed, I merely signified by a nod that my visit was of no consequence, and went out. On returning about an hour afterwards, I saw Ivan putting 3 pink letters into the letter box of the hotel. I attached no significance to this very ordinary fact at the time, but went up to my room and began writing my letters, one of which was to my lawyer, sending him an important receipt. The dinner bell sounded before I had half finished this letter, but I wrote on, determined to have done with it at once, in case the afternoon should offer any expedition with Bourgonef. At dinner he quietly intimated that Ivan had informed him of my visit, and apologized for not having been able to see me. I, of course, assured him that no apology was necessary, and that we had plenty of time to visit sculpture together without intruding on his private hours. He informed me that he was that afternoon going to pay a visit to Schwanthaler, the sculptor, and if I desired it, he would ask permission on another occasion to take me with him. I jumped at the proposal, as may be supposed. Dinner over, I strolled into the Englische Garten, and had my coffee and cigar there. On my return I was vexed to find that in the hurry of finishing my letters I had sealed the one to my lawyer, and had not enclosed the receipt which had been the object of writing. Fortunately it was not too late. Descending to the bureau of the hotel, I explained my mistake to the head waiter, who unlocked the letter box to search for my letter. It was found at once, for there were only 7 or 8 in the box. Among these my eye naturally caught the 3 pink letters which I had that morning seen Ivan drop into the box, but although they were seen by me, they were not noticed at the time, my mind being solely occupied with rectifying the stupid blunder I had made. Once more in my own room, a sudden revelation startled me. Everyone knows what it is to have details come under the eye which the mind first interprets long after the eye ceases to rest upon them. The impressions are received passively, but they are registered, and can be calmly read whenever the mind is in activity. It was so now. I suddenly, as if now for the first time, saw that the addresses on Bourgonef's letters were written in a fluent, masterly hand, bold in character, and with a certain sweep which might have come from a painter. The thrill which this vision gave me will be intelligible when you remember that Bourgonef had lost, or pretended to have lost, his right arm, and was, as I before intimated, far from dexterous with his left. That no man recently thrown upon the use of a left hand could have written those addresses was too evident. What, then, was the alternative? The empty sleeve was an imposture. At once the old horrible suspicion returned, and this time with tenfold violence, and with damnatory confirmation. Pressing my temples between my hands, I tried to be calm and to survey the evidence without precipitation, but for some time the conflict of thoughts was too violent. Whatever might be the explanation, clear it was that Bourgonef, for some purposes, was practicing a deception, and had, as I knew, other means of disguising his appearance. This, on the most favorable interpretation, branded him with suspicion. This excluded him from the circle of honest men. But did it connect him with the murder of Lieschen Lehfeldt? In my thought it did so indubitably, but I was aware of the difficulty of making this clear to anyone else. Chapter 6. First Love. If the reader feels that my suspicions were not wholly unwarranted, were indeed inevitable, he will not laugh at me on learning that once more these suspicions were set aside, and the fact, the damnatory fact as I regarded it, discovered by me so accidentally, and I thought providentially, was robbed of all its significance by Bourgonef himself casually and carelessly avowing it in conversation, just as one may avow a secret infirmity with some bitterness, but without any implication of deceit in its concealment. I was the more prepared for this revulsion of feeling by the difficulty I felt in maintaining my suspicions in the presence of one so gentle and so refined. He had come into my room that evening to tell me of his visit to Schwanthaler, and of the sculptor's flattering desire to make my personal acquaintance. He spoke of Schwanthaler and his earnest efforts in art with so much enthusiasm, and was altogether so charming, that I felt abashed before him, incapable of ridding myself of the dreadful suspicions, yet incapable of firmly believing him to be what I thought. But more than this, there came the new interest awakened in me by his story, and when, in the course of his story, he accidentally disclosed the fact that he had not lost his arm, all my suspicions vanished at once. We had got, as usual, upon politics, and were differing more than usual, because he gave greater prominence to his sympathy with the Red Republicans. He accused me of not being thoroughgoing, which I admitted. This he attributed to the fact of my giving a divided heart to politics, a condition natural enough at my age, and with my hopes. "Well," I said, laughing, "you don't mean to take a lofty stand upon your few years' seniority. If my age renders it natural, does yours profoundly alter such a conviction?" "My age, no. But you have the hopes of youth. I have none. I am banished forever from the joys and sorrows of domestic life, and therefore, to live at all, must consecrate my soul to great abstractions and public affairs." "But why banished, unless self-banished?" "Woman's love is impossible. You look incredulous. I do not allude to this," he said, taking up the empty sleeve, and by so doing sending a shiver through me. "The loss of your arm," I said, and my voice trembled slightly, for I felt that a crisis was at hand, "although a misfortune to you, would really be an advantage in gaining a woman's affections. Women are so romantic that their imaginations are so easily touched." "Yes," he replied bitterly, "but the trouble is that I have not lost my arm." I started. He spoke bitterly, yet calmly. I awaited his explanation in great suspense. "To have lost my arm in battle, or even by an accident, would perhaps have lent me a charm in woman's eyes. But, as I said, my arm hangs by my side, withered, unpresentable." I breathed again. He continued in the same tone, and without noticing my looks. "But it is not this which banishes me. Woman's love might be hoped for, had I far worse infirmities. The cause lies deeper. It lies in my history. A wall of granite has grown up between me and the sex." "But, my dear fellow, do you, wounded, as I presume to guess, by some unworthy woman, extend the fault of one to the whole sex? Do you despair of finding another true, because a first was false?" "They are all false," he exclaimed with energy. "Not perhaps all false from inherent viciousness, though many are that, but false because their inherent weakness renders them incapable of truth. Oh, I know the catalogue of their good qualities. They are often pitiful, self-devoting, generous, but they are so by fits and starts, just as they are cruel, remorseless, exacting by fits and starts. They have no constancy. They are too weak to be constant, even in evil. Their minds are all impressions, their actions are all the issue of immediate promptings. Swayed by the fleeting impulses of the hour, they have only one persistent, calculable motive on which reliance can always be placed. That motive is vanity. You are always sure of them there. It is from vanity they are good. From vanity they are evil. Their devotion and their desertion equally vanity. I know them. To me they have disclosed the shallows of their natures. God, how I have suffered from them!" A deep, low exclamation, half sob, half curse, closed his tirade. He remained silent for a few minutes, looking on the floor, then, suddenly turning his eyes upon me, said, "Were you ever in Heidelberg?" "Never." "I thought all your countrymen went there. Then you will never have heard anything of my story. Shall I tell you how my youth was blighted? Will you care to listen?" "It would interest me much." "I had reached the age of 27, he began, without having once known even the vague stirrings of the passion of love. I admired many women, and courted the admiration of them all, but I was as yet not only heart whole, but, to use your Shakespeare's phrase, Cupid had not tapped me on the shoulder. This detail is not unimportant in my story. You may possibly have observed that in those passionate natures which reserve their force, and do not fritter away their feelings in scattered flirtations or trivial love affairs, there is a velocity and momentum, when the movement of passion is once excited, greatly transcending all that is ever felt by expansive and expressive natures. Slow to be moved, when they do move it is with the whole mass of the heart. So it was with me. I purchased my immunity from earlier entanglements by the price of my whole life. I am not what I was. Between my past and present self there is a gulf. That gulf is dark, stormy, and profound. On the far side stands a youth of hope, energy, ambition, and unclouded happiness, with great capacities for loving. On this side, a blighted manhood, with no prospects but suffering and storm. He paused. With an effort he seemed to master the suggestions which crowded upon his memory, and continued his narrative in an equable tone. I had been for several weeks at Heidelberg. One of my intimate companions was Kästner, the architect, and one day he proposed to introduce me to his sister-in-law, Ottilie, of whom he had repeatedly spoken to me in terms of great affection and esteem. We went, and were most cordially received. Ottilie justified Kästner's praises. Pretty, but not strikingly so. Clever, but not obtrusively so. Her soft dark eyes were frank and winning. Her manner was gentle and retiring, with that dash of sentimentalism which seems native to all German girls, but without any of the ridiculous extravagance too often seen in them. I liked her all the more because I was perfectly at my ease with her, and this was rarely the case in my relations to young women. I don't enjoy their society. You leap at once to the conclusion that we fell in love. Your conclusion is precipitate. Seeing her continually, I grew to admire and respect her, but the significant smiles, winks, and hints of friends, pointing unmistakably at a supposed understanding existing between us, only made me more seriously examine the state of my feelings, and assured me that I was not in love. It is true that I felt a serene pleasure in her society, and that, when away from her, she occupied much of my thoughts. It is true that I often thought of her as a wife, and in these meditations she appeared as one eminently calculated to make a happy home. But it is no less true that, during a temporary absence of hers of a few weeks, I felt no sort of uneasiness, no yearning for her presence, no vacancy in my life. I knew, therefore, that it was not love which I felt. So much for my feelings. What of hers? They seemed very like my own. That she admired me and was pleased to be with me was certain. That she had a particle of fiery love for me I could not believe, and it was probably this very sense of her calmness which kept my feelings quiet. For love is a flame which often can be kindled only by contact with flame. Certainly this is so in proud, reserved natures, which are chilled by any contact with temperature not higher than their own. On her return, however, from that absence I have mentioned, I was not a little fluttered by an obvious change in her manner, an impression which subsequent meetings only served to confirm. Although still very quiet, her manner had become more tender, and it had that delicious shyness which is the most exquisite of flatteries, as it is one of the most enchanting of graces. I saw her tremble slightly beneath my voice, and blush beneath my gaze. There was no mistaking these signs. It was clear that she loved me, and it was no less clear that I, taking fire at this discovery, was myself rapidly falling in love. I will not keep you from my story by idle reflections. Take another cigar." He rose and paced up and down the room in silence. End of Bourgonef, Part 2.